From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And here's what's ahead today. Offering considerations on Topdress Fertilizer for winter wheat, given the state of the crop currently, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. Dorivar says that you producers should think not only about top-dressing nitrogen, but possibly sulfur and chloride where needed. Then, on the latest FSA Coffee Talk, Carla Wicoff of the Farm Service Agency reminds you producers of the latest opportunity to enroll acreage in the General Conservation Reserve Program. She goes over what practices and criteria will be evaluated for enrollment. And back in later, K-State's Charlie Lee, this week talking about the practice of trapping deer antler sheds and why he strongly discourages that. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others, and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome once again. Wheat crop producers, as you eagerly watch your fields to see how they're going to weather this dry winter, you have some questions coming up about whether or not to top dress that nitrogen, and if so, how to manage that fertilizer application. And we're going to ask for some thoughts on that now from Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, who is a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Dorivar, top dressing is fairly routine as a practice here in Kansas, but once more, with struggling conditions out there, producers may give a second thought to this practice.
Yes, Eric, as you mentioned, it's been really dry in most of the state, and so it is a challenge. And one of the key questions when it comes to top dressing that we need to start planning now is what's going to be the potential yield for that wheat crop, and that's going to be one of the first things we need to evaluate. Essentially, each situation is going to be different, and we do have some that is perhaps a yield potential will be affected significantly. In other cases, maybe not so much, and so we have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about potential yields and whether or not we need to make some sort of adjustments to our plan rate of application of nitrogen. Typically, when we plant wheat in the fall, we have in mind a nitrogen management, a nitrogen rate that we're thinking of applying. But obviously, with top dressing, we can make some adjustments at this point based on the situation of each particular field. So that is something to keep in mind, and I think we have to consider that. However, on the other hand, also something I want to emphasize is that we do need that nitrogen. And again, if conditions improve, we do get the moisture, that yield potential could still be there. And we want to make sure we have enough nitrogen there to meet that yield potential that we are expecting there. And so that's the first step is basically to think about, evaluate the rates and then think about other characteristics, other key points as well for top dressing. One of those to keep in mind is the time of application of nitrogen. If we're thinking about nitrogen in particular, when is that going to be needed? Again, now we have still plenty of time to plan on that and make sure we provide that nitrogen. Typically, we say we want to have that nitrogen before jointing. And so, again, think about that. We do have plenty of time, but there's also some research that shows that even later application of nitrogen can still be useful and actually meet the requirements of that wheat crop. A lot of that also depends on what kind of nitrogen management we have so far. You know, in many cases, we already apply some nitrogen at planting time with the starter, and obviously that's going to take care of all the nitrogen needs pretty much until early spring when that crop is really start to grow. So, in other words, we don't need a lot of nitrogen now, really, and so we have that window for application, and we have to keep that in mind. We don't need to go too early as well, and that's something that it is an advantage because give us an opportunity to maybe assess the situation a little bit more in the next few weeks. And see where we are and what kind of adjustment maybe we want to make. Essentially, we do have the time for that.
But again, though, as far as adjusting those N rates, don't get carried away is what you're saying.
Yes, and again, like I say, a lot of that is really based largely on the experience and the evaluation that each producer is doing for a particular field. But because, again, each field is going to be different depending on what level of moisture we have in that particular field and the potential for that field. And so, again, we have to keep that in mind and try to evaluate each situation separately. Again, one of the things that I would like to avoid is just cutting back across everything, for example, without evaluating each particular field, which, again, the potential could still be there, and we don't want to be short of nitrogen.
On top of the rates and the timing, though, should one think about alternate sources of nitrogen for any reason here, or stay with the tried and true, be it broadcast or be it a more targeted application?
That's a really good point, and we do have many options, of course, when it comes to source. More commonly, we're going to use UAN liquid or dry urea. Those tends to be the most common options for top dressing. And a lot of that depends on the management practice for each particular producer. Some may prefer to use UAN. There's also price, obviously, that needs to be considered for this, choosing the right source. There are a couple concerns there, and one of them is what about volatilization losses? And obviously, we know that using dry urea will tend to be more sensitive to potential volatilization, just because we are talking 100% urea versus a UAN, which is going to be only 50% urea. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So for no-till, where we'll be putting all of that on the maybe on heavy residue, in some cases, that could have an effect. That also brings the other point, which is potential for perhaps tie-up problems. And again, if we are comparing dry versus liquid, typically dry fertilizer will tend to be less sensitive to tie-up problems. And again, heavy residue situations, we may see a little bit of advantage in that case. And so again, we have to keep that in mind. And also tied to a source of nitrogen, one thing that we often ask is, what about additives? Again, do we use additives for some of these nitrogen sources? And typically the main potential is some level of volatilization. We have to keep in mind that temperature is low, so that volatilization also tends to be much lower if you compare that to corn, for example, in the summer for side dressing. So those volatilization potentials are low, and so we have the possibility of using some urease inhibitors that can help a little bit in those situations. In terms of nitrification inhibitor, typically we don't see a lot of benefits in the case of top dressing wheat. Again, just because we don't have the potential for significant losses during this time of the year. And so again, those are some of the key things we have to keep in mind when it comes to sources. But it basically obviously go back to either liquid or dry for top dressing.
Aligned with that, what about the placement of the product itself? Is that a variable to be concerned with here?
That's a very good point, and it is a potential key factor, especially, again, in no-till system with heavy residue. Like I mentioned, tie-up could be a problem. And so if we're talking, for example, broadcasting UAN, if we are broadcasting liquid, we can have the potential for more tie-up of that nitrogen, and that could be obviously a concern. Will leave less nitrogen available to that wheat crop. And so using things like streamer bars, for example, that will basically concentrate the liquid and pass through that residue and get into the soil is going to be a huge improvement in terms of minimizing any potential tie-up situation. So when it comes to placement, really we're talking using conventional broadcast versus using things like streamer bars for liquids, and we do see some clear benefits, especially in no-till systems when we are streaming that UAN for nitrogen use.
Once more, though, as you're thinking of your nitrogen top dressing, do process all of this and make your decisions according on all the factors in play here. It's not just nitrogen, though, Dorivar. Recent years, we've seen quite a bit of discussion about sulfur deficiencies in wheat production, and that can be addressed in the top dress application as well.
Yes, and this is the time to think about this. We are seeing especially some history of sulfur deficiency. I think we'll definitely need to include sulfur as part of the program. It is the right time to apply as a top dress, especially if we're using something like ammonium thiosulfate that will be basically easily combined with UAN. We can apply some level of sulfur at that time with the top dress is immediately available. And so that will be an excellent source of sulfur and an excellent way to apply sulfur at this point. Again, we know that many producers are already using other sources and maybe apply already sulfur back in the fall at planting time, and that's fine. In that situation, obviously, we don't need to do anything at this point. We're already taking care of that. But again, for those that are relying on top dressing primarily, this is an excellent time for sulfur application. The key again here is that we have to try to identify where we may see a potential benefit from that sulfur application. And we are seeing a lot more deficiency show up in the state, but there's going to be some conditions that tend to be more sensitive and will tend to show more deficiency issues. And those are going to be, more of those sandier soils, low organic matter situations. Those typically will be the candidates to definitely try and supply some sulfur application in those particular fields.
And another candidate for top dressing, we want to slip a word in on it too. Chloride could be included here. In what situations typically?
Yes, and we have a lot of research on chloride for winter wheat in Kansas, and typically we tend to see more consistent yield responses in the central part of the state, where we do tend to have some level of maybe leaching of that chloride from the soil. And so, again, it is a mobile nutrient, just like sulfur and nitrogen. And so it's not going to stay there. And if it's not staying there, obviously we need to do some regular applications. Again, it's a nutrient that can be easily applied at top dressing. It will be immediately available to the crop in the spring. And so, again, especially in the central part of the state, especially some of the sandier soils, those are going to be, again, candidates for chloride application. And again, we do tend to see some consistent response in those soils.
In any event, producers should think about their top dress fertilizer management somewhat carefully here, and don't get in a rush. There's still time, you say.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. Again, we do have time, and that's very important. Sometimes we want to go ahead and apply that nitrogen too early. We have a lot of data that shows that the window is bigger, and so we do have time, and so keep that in mind.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts on taking this on, as it's one of the more standard practices that our wheat growers out there utilize. Appreciate it, Dorivar. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
He's a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. And we'll be back with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned to Agriculture Today, and we're around to time once again for another FSA Coffee Talk, our session featuring folk from the Farm Service Agency state headquarters for Kansas as they brief us on what's going on with various USDA programs. Carla Wicoff is with us once more, agricultural program specialist out of the state office. And Carla is among those who oversees the implementation of a program we've become extremely well familiar with here in Kansas over the past 30 years or so. Still, it's highly active, the Conservation Reserve Program. Carla, welcome once more, and we are in the midst of a general CRP sign-up, which we'll refer to in detail, but the basics of the CRP, every once in a while it's good to revisit those.
Right. I thought I'd start out this time just stepping back a little bit and telling everybody what CRP is, Conservation Reserve Program. It's a voluntary program to establish and maintain a permanent cover, and FSA will cost share 50% of the eligible costs to help establish that permanent cover, and then they also pay an annual rental payment for the life of the CRP contract. So different practices have different terms, some 10, some 15 years, and some in between. So the objective of CRP is to assist owners and operators in conserving and improving the nation's soil, water, and wildlife resources. You do have to follow a conservation plan that has a requirement to meet some certain practice standards, and you also have to complete maybe 1 to 2 management practices during the life of the CRP contract. There's no cost share for that portion, but there are options within that management requirement to do prescribed burning, interseeding, light disking, or haying and grazing. So there are some options with that. So with that, then, we're in a general CRP sign-up right now. So those are competitive offers. So there's a competition there to get in that program. And that sign-up ends February 12th.
It's coming up soon,
yes, very soon. So if you have any interest in the general portion of the CRP sign-up, you need to contact your FSA Service Center to set up an appointment and explore what the possibilities are, what kind of options you might have on the land that you may be interested in putting in the ground into CRP.
What are the land practices that are going to be accepted by way of this general CRP sign-up this time around?
General CRP practices, normally they're the larger fields that we're talking about. So one of the practices is just establishment of permanent native grass, and that's a 10-year practice. Another option is a permanent wildlife habitat, has a different cover, more prone to help out the wildlife. That's also a 10-year practice. We also have practice that's very popular in Kansas, which is the CP25 rare and declining habitat. And one of the reasons it's more popular is you get a few more points, so it helps lift in that competition. It helps a little bit with that environmental benefit index to help you maybe get accepted a little bit easier in there when there's more competition.
And that index is how distinctions are made between acceptance and decline.
Right, that's right. It's at the end of the sign-up, once sign-up's over, the national office then reviews all the offers, and they set a level of where they would accept sign-ups. So the higher your number is, the better chance you have of being accepted in that program. There's also another practice that it actually used to be a continuous sign-up, and it's moved over to general, which is the state acres for wildlife enhancement. It's also native grasses, but it has some other practices that can go along with that. So, like I said, if you have an interest in CRP, especially in the general sign-up CRP, that sign-up ends February 12th, and you need to contact your office and set up an appointment to look at that.
And those local folks will help you walk through the options that you just listed and perhaps give guidance as to how to put that application together for the greatest potential for success.
Yes, that's right. They're very good at helping you out. And, you know those people in the offices know your farm and your area, and they can definitely help you out with that.
So the deadline again for applying for General CRP, February the 12th. More or less the timeline for processing. When might producers expect to hear whether or not they've been successful with their application?
Eric, that's a hard question. Each time it's different. It kind of depends on, what all the factors that they're taking into account on CRP. I know there's been times it's been a little shorter, and as you see, I'm avoiding telling you a specific period of time because we don't know. The national office takes care of that. We try to, as soon as we get notified, we notify the producers, and sometimes that's, maybe 6 weeks, 2 months. Sometimes it's been a longer period than that, unfortunately.
You're at the mercy of the national office.
Yes, we are. Yes.
But nonetheless, folks need to keep in mind that it is a national competition.
Yes.
So that's why this is a rather thorough process.
Yes, that's right. Because they're reviewing. They're looking at for each offer, they're looking at all the what they call environmental benefit indexes, which are different points for like the cover that you have out there, for the type of land that you have, for how much it costs for your offer. And then there's just some different environmental type factors that all come into that. And part of that is also the type of cover that you're planting. It makes a difference. Some covers get more points because, they're environmental friendly with wildlife, water, soil. All of those things are taken into account. And so they look at that and pull that all together, and they establish a level of points of where they're going to accept those. And, there's the other factor of how many acres do we want to accept in the CRP to stay within that national allotment. So all of those factors weigh in. So more people that come in and submit offers, the more competitive it is.
All the more reason to put your offer together in as comprehensive way as possible.
Right.
There's the other CRP alternative here, Carla. That is the Continuous Conservation Reserve Program. And as the name implies, that's always at the hand of the producer if they're interested.
Right. That continuous CRP is non-competitive, so it's ongoing continually. Those sign-up offers are approved if the producer meets all the eligibility requirements and they don't exceed the maximum soil rental rate on the acreage that they're offering. You still have to go through the eligibility process, but it's a little bit easier to get through. The thing about continuous sign-up practices are that a lot of times they are the smaller acreage type practices. There's field windbreaks and shelter belts, waterways, grass strips, filter strips, playas, and then we also have a habitat buffer for upland birds. And some of these practices are 10-year practices, and some of them are somewhere in between 10 and 15, but the 15 would be the maximum for those.
And you say there's an incentive payment structure within the continuous CRP?
Yes. The practices under the continuous sign-up have what we call sign-up incentive payments. You get an extra payment on top of your rental payment. And then we also have practice incentive payments. So that is an extra, I think it's 20% on top of your cost share that you're already getting to plant those permanent covers that you're putting on that ground.
Again, no deadline involved here, but just as with the general CRP, you do as an applicant need to have a dialogue with the FSA local personnel.
Right, that's correct. Just to give you a perspective, the CRP program's been a huge success in Kansas, and we have 1.789, just over 1.789 million acres enrolled in CRP in Kansas, and that accounts for just under 9% of the total CRP acreage in the United States. So, yeah, successful program for Kansas. National CRP acreage is just over 20 million right now. There is a national CRP cap, and for 2021, that acreage cap is 25 million. As you can see, we're still under that a little bit, so we have a little ways to go to get up to that maximum amount. But just want to encourage you to contact your local service center if you're interested in participating.
Kansas has been a primary player in the CRP virtually since its inception, and that has not changed whatsoever in the many years. So once more, discuss it over with your local FSA staff. And speaking of staff, we do want to acknowledge, as we did visit with now former State Director David Shim a few days back upon his departure from the agency, there will be a new State Director appointed at some point, Carla, you say.
That's correct, and we appreciate David's leadership while he was with FSA in Kansas, and we wish him the very best moving forward. But looking at that, like you said, because of a new administration change, we will have a new state executive director that will be headquartered here in Manhattan at the FSA office here. But until that permanent appointment is completed, we will have Chuck Pettijohn serve in the acting position until they've made that final appointment. Mr. Pettijohn is currently serving as the FSA District Director in Southeast Kansas, and we're excited to have him come in and help with the leadership of our office.
Very well. Carla, thanks for joining us once again, and we will catch up with you quite soon.
All right. Thank you, Eric.
Over from the Farm Service Agency, state headquarters for Kansas, Carla Wicoff, Agricultural Program Specialist there, on this latest edition of the FSA Coffee Talk, featured every other Tuesday here on Agriculture Today. And after this break, we'll be back with more for you here on the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson with you, and on we go now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. President-elect Joe Biden has nominated Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Commissioner Jewel Bronaugh as the Deputy Secretary of the USDA. Bronaugh holds a doctorate in career and technical education from Virginia Tech University and brings to the USDA an extensive career working with extension programs. If confirmed, Bronaugh would serve the incoming Secretary Tom Vilsack as his second-in-command at the USDA. Bronaugh has served as Commissioner for the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services since May of 2018, but had previously served as Virginia's State Executive Director for the Farm Service Agency, appointed by Vilsack back in 2015. And before leading Virginia's FSA offices, Bronaugh was the Dean of the College of Agriculture at Virginia State University, overseeing extension research and academic programs there. A new sign-up period for the USDA's main coronavirus assistance program begins today. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
A new sign-up period for the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program runs through February 26th.
There's really maybe 3 categories.
Farm Service Agency Administrator Richard Fordyce says some groups have been added to the CFAP program.
The new ones, so contract growers, I think if you think about adding in the sales commodities, the pullets and the turf grass, they're going to need to create an application. They're going to have an application.
Producers also may need to amend their applications. Meanwhile, another change involves top-up payments for swine producers.
We're pulling the inventory numbers from CFAP 1. Those folks don't need to reapply. Frankly, they don't need to do anything. We have those inventory numbers.
He adds that local staff will make sure the extra swine producer payments are distributed. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And one more last-minute reminder for you producers, particularly in the High Plains region, that the K-State Cover Your Acres Winter Conference will take place later on today online, and you can still register for that. It'll run from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock this afternoon. It is a live virtual event, complete with discussion and question and answer sessions. You'll be able to access it from your home or elsewhere via Zoom or YouTube Live, or you can attend one of several watch parties to be held across western Kansas. The current location for those participating in person, with, again, COVID restrictions and precautions to be followed, at the Finney County Fairgrounds, Ness County Fairgrounds, Norton County Fairgrounds, the Scott County Fairgrounds, and the Extension Office in Stevens County. Again, here is the lineup for the Cover Your Acres Conference. From Texas A&M, Panhandle agronomist Jordan Bell with a look at water use of weeds in dryland systems. K-State weed scientist Vipan Kumar on current weed control research in western Kansas. And a look at managing the highs and lows of soil pH. One of our guests from earlier in the broadcast, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, with that presentation. Also in the lineup this afternoon, the economics of dryland rotations and tillage systems, K-State's Lucas Haig with that, and K-State weed management specialist Sarah Lancaster on new frontiers in sorghum weed control. The Cover Your Acres Winter Conference virtually this afternoon from 1 until 5. Register now. northwest.ksu.edu/coveryouracres. It's a free event. northwest.ksu.edu/coveryouracres. Now this week's Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the foot baths that we use to try to control some of the hoof issues that we have on our dairy herds. What I really want to hit on today is some mistakes that we oftentimes make as we operate those foot baths. And one of them is a very, very basic thing that we really should have a handle on, but many times that we don't. And that's just the amount of volume that actually that foot bath holds. So we've got all kinds of calculations we can do, and typically we look at the length times the width times the depth is how we figure that out. And there are many different calculators that we could use to do that. University of Wisconsin has an excellent one if you're looking for something to use, just where you can input numbers and get a output from that. But the basic issue is how much water does that foot bath actually hold? For example, if you have a foot bath that is 10 foot long which is the current recommendation, which is longer than probably most of us have on many of our dairy farms, 2 foot wide, and it's 3 inches deep, then that means that foot bath holds about 37 gallons of water. Well, what if you fill it to 4 inches today? Well, that would be 50 gallons of water. What about 5 inches? That'd be 62, and 6 inches would be 75. Well, why is that important? Well, if you did your chemical calculations based on 3 inches of depth or 37 gallons, and today you decide to fill it to 4 inches, or your employee decides to fill it to 4 inches rather than 3 inches, well, that increase in water volume means that now your chemical concentration is off by 35%. In other words, it's not as strong as it should be. What if you were figuring 4 inches and you accidentally filled to 5 inches? Well, now you're off by 24%. And if you were figuring 5 inches and now you're 6 inches, you're off by 21%. So as you increase the calculation depth that you used in the equation, making mistakes become a little bit less, but they're still very significant. So what's the impact of not having the concentration of whatever chemical we're using correct? Well, if we're not at the right concentration, we're probably not going to get the result that we expect. Now, you can be too weak. You can also be too strong. So you need to keep this all in balance. So one of the things I'd encourage you to do today is if you're operating your foot bath, go out there and take a measurement to see how deep it actually is at the operating level you normally run. And as you take that depth measurement, where should you take that? You probably should take it in the very center of the foot bath. The reason for that, if there's a little bit of slope to the floor, you should get a good average in the very center of the foot bath, assuming that the bottom of the foot bath is absolutely flat and we just have end-to-end slope involved. Then take those numbers back and plug them into a spreadsheet to see if you've been doing your calculations right. If not, make the necessary adjustments and make sure that your employees understand that the depth of that foot bath is very, very important. And it's important to make sure that we keep the right concentration of the chemical that we might be using in that foot bath today. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to go and take a look at the actual depth of the solution in their foot baths.
Thanks, Mike, and this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Up for you now on This Agriculture Today. Former wildlife specialist Charlie Lee, K-State Research and Extension, is back by for his weekly talk on wildlife management. A closer look, this time around, Charlie, at the process of deer antler shedding and the use of antler traps, which we'll explain in just a moment. But go over the biology, if you will, of shedding during the buck's lifetime.
Well, there is a natural deer antler shedding process, and that begins with the bucks that have 2 pedicels on their skull. They're really the bases that grow a new antler each year. As those deer consume forage throughout the spring, summer, and fall, and consume those minerals that you've got out at various locations, those antlers grow and harden throughout the summer. Then as winter wears on, those changing hormones as a result of photoperiod cues start to trigger the buck's pedicels to dissolve minerals along what's called an adsätion line. Then as deer start to reabsorb those minerals, that layer and that line weakens and becomes a little bit crumbly, and that's what forms that roughly spherical base that you find at the end of the deer antler sheds. If a buck deer gets his antlers stuck or lodged in something that's too hard before that abscission line has dissolved completely, then it can cause a portion of that pedicel, which is actually a part of the deer skull, to break loose with the antler. And when that breaks off with the antler, it can cause significant injury. and sometimes the best case scenario, it can cause a grossly deformed antlers for the rest of that deer's life, and that's probably the best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, you can get a brain abscess or infection that goes on down into the brain because it's essentially an open wound for a period of time, and that can become infected with bacteria, and then you get a fatal brain abscess. There's also some problems associated with increased stress when the animal is fighting or struggling because they're captured. Remember, at the late time of year in the season, when deer are already at probably their lowest nutritional plane of the year, now they're tangled up and trying to escape for a short period of time. That's just an additional stress that's already placed upon an animal that's going through the stress from a reproductive season and perhaps some defense mechanisms as well as they may be fighting for breeding partners. You also have shorter food reserves and energy supplies at that time of year, so then the fight to escape some kind of entanglement with their antlers can make the difference between that animal surviving or becoming a fatality.
It's an important variable in the biology of the deer, but the antler shed can also be useful in respect to deer population management decisions, you say.
Well, there are people that want to collect shed antlers for various reasons, and there's a wide range of reasons why people are collecting antlers. But there are some deer managers that use those antlers to try to keep a track of the quality of their male deer in the herd. But I think there's other options, and certainly better options than using antler traps. And the antler traps are not anything very sophisticated. I've seen them designed just out of cattle panels. I've seen them out of bungee cords and fishing line and heavier duty monofilament line, anything that's going to attract those antlers. Most oftentimes those traps are associated with bait piles or feed piles. But I think when people understand the potential negatives associated with them, they realize that perhaps there's other options. And one of the best options out there, I think, is trail cameras. And not just having the cameras out there, but using the data and the information that you see on all of those images. And I'm guilty, like many of the deer hunters in this state, of putting out trail cameras and very quickly looking at those images to see, which animal has the highest quality of antlers. But you can get some better information by more closely studying those images and looking at them in a sequential manner. You get an idea of the animals that are out there. You can quickly learn to estimate size without causing that increased stress on the animal. You can also do things to reduce that stress male deer have at this time of year by providing energy. It doesn't need to be carbohydrates that's provided in a deer food pile, a bait pile. It can be food plots. Crop residues that are left over are a great source, and make sure that there's plenty of food resources out there to keep those energy levels up for deer. And then the other way, it's kind of the low-tech method, is just spend some time out there in deer stands observing the herd. By spending more time there looking at the animals, you get a good idea of herd dynamics, deer behavior, as well as antler size.
But the point here is you don't want to jeopardize the well-being of the buck with an antler trap device of whatever kind you come up with. Because, for one thing, you could tug on those antlers when they're not ready to be released, biologically speaking, and cause damage.
Yes, although Kansas doesn't have regulations that restricts antler traps, there are a few states that do. I don't think that really matters. In my opinion, if we're trying to be good stewards of wildlife, we wouldn't be utilizing antler traps.
And once again, the deer antler shed is to begin here very soon around Kansas, if it hasn't already. So there's some background on the process itself and the reason you might want to not employ antler traps if you're using antlers as an indicator of deer management. Charlie, thanks for this look. That's from longtime wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research and Extension, along with This Weekly right here. Well, our time's away once more. Looking ahead to tomorrow's broadcast, we'll hear from one of our regular guests, agricultural law and taxation professor from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McGowan. Roger has put together his top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2020, and we'll count those down with Roger and talk of their importance to you agricultural producers tomorrow right here. Please rejoin us then. In the meantime, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.